Darkness is pelted, out of blackness comes the bomb. Negro and Indian screaming, onto the roadway they fall. Is this the only way races will join today? Join in barbarous death, gun, raj, and Monroe. All end in agony. When will our hatreds end? And race with race work together as friends. Anywhere hatred is sown, violence will grow and be spread. First Alice crushed in the roadway, and Gardner cut down and dead. Now
let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues which not only concern Guyanese, but which can move Guyanese beyond the past, beyond the problems we've had in the past, and build a better life for everyone, particularly the next generation, for our children. And this year, 2024, we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the disturbances, one of the bloodiest periods of Guyanese history. And the song by Nesbitt Changur became almost an anthem in 1964 because it symbolized the tragedy of Guyanese, of all ethnicities who suffered from PPP violence in that year. In particular, my friends, I am dealing with this issue of violence because it was the strike by the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union, a 165-day strike in 1964. It was a season of unprecedented terrorist violence and murders. But today, particularly, I would like to look at massacres. What is a massacre? I mean, did we have massacres before? Yes, I suppose in the colonial period, you can say that the police shot sugar workers at Rose Hall, Kanji, Enmore, Rhineville. But these were riots. But we grew past those sugar plantation disturbances. And in 1964, we saw massacres returning. These were not police trying to quell riots. These were armed members of the PPP and the Guyana Agricultural Workers Union who were carrying out atrocities. And the indiscriminate killing of a large number of unresisting victims in a single event, it had become frighteningly frequent during 1964. I suppose people in the diaspora would know about these shootings at schools, at the Columbine High School and all that. But this was a novelty for Guyana in 1964, in which people who were innocent, ordinary farmers and villagers were being gunned down in large numbers. So this year, 2024, we mark the 60th anniversary of some of the worst massacres in this country history, which occurred in the year 1964. And let us always remember Nesbitt Changur's lament. And the killing started at Tain Public Road. These two people, Gunraj and Monroe, were killed by a Gahu bomb. It wasn't thrown, it was placed in the lorry that was taking them back Albion Estate. And when it reached a certain point, both came from Manchester, both Gunraj and Monroe and Gunraj came from Manchester. And as it went to Tain, that's when the bomb was timed to explode. And when you look at the disturbances, you see all of the PPP bombs were made in the same way. They were timed to explode at a certain place. This is what happened at Sun Chapman. This is what happened at Tain with the Booker Sugar Estate lorry. My friends, when we speak of the disturbances, we speak of a period of calculated terror. This was aimed at preventing the holding of general elections. I mean, you can almost call it electoral violence. It was aimed at preventing the holding of general elections in accordance with the constitutional change ordained by the British, that we should move away from the unbalanced first past the post system, which repeatedly brought us a government which was a minority. As I explained previously, under the first past the post system, the PPP was winning 42% of the vote and getting 58% of the seats, whereas the PNC and United Post together were winning 58% of the vote and getting 42% of the seats. So the British government, on the agreement with the PNC, UF, and PPP, said the system should be changed to proportional representation. Since 1964, for 60 years, we have had a proportional representation system in Guyana. But the PPP wanted to prevent elections under that system in 1964. They wanted to gain independence before fresh elections were held. So they would be in office under an independent government. And they wanted to remain in office beyond 1964, perhaps into 1965. This is what the hurricane of protest was all about. This is what the disturbance is all about. It's all about control by the People's Progressive Party. The PPP told its supporters that they were betrayed by the British government and that the PR system, the proportional representation system, would see them having to leave office, and the office that they gained under this unbalanced first past the post system, which gave them a majority in the legislative assembly, although they were a minority with the vote. It was in this vein that the PPP inspired, or the PPP affiliated union, the Guyana Agricultural Union, Workers Union. Since then it was called GAWU, but GUIANA, of course, after independence, it changed it to GUYANA. And they started disorder in the sugar industry, but it was a pretext to achieve the aims of postponing elections and avoiding the imposition of the PR system and avoiding elections before independence. And the GAWU strike was started on the pretext of trying to gain recognition from the British Guiana Sugar Producers Association. But the BGSP at that time already recognized the Manpower Citizen Association. And they said the GAWU provided them no evidence, no proof that it had the majority support. So the strike's real purpose was not about recognition, because that was never a possibility in March or February or March 1964. The real purpose of the strike was to mobilize stormtroops to reinforce the party's political program, the hurricane of protest. So on the ground, you had thousands and thousands of sugar workers who were being told that they needed to prevent the elections being held under the PR system. But at the political level, you had this political declaration of a hurricane of protest. In short, my friends, the PPP tried to depict or to portray the so-called hurricane of protest to the international community and even to the national community as an anti-colonial struggle. I mean, this was really farcical. They're killing ordinary people in boats and their homes. They're burning down houses. and trying to tell the international community that they were really fighting against the British Empire. You know, they wanted to pretend they were like the revolutionaries in Colombia and Cuba and Guatemala and Nicaragua and Venezuela, all these left-wing movements. They tried to tell the public, the international public, the international community, that they were one of these revolutionaries fighting against the British Empire. But the Gao strike for recognition in the sugar industry was really a pretext for a campaign of violence. And the hurricane started, it was launched in January, even though the strike did not start officially until March. But by December 1964, it just petered out. And we will discuss why it petered out. Because in December 1964, the PPP was defeated in the general elections by a combination of the PNC and United Force. And Dr. Jagan refused to remove from office, and the Queen had to issue a special order in council. And of course, the British Army was present here. So by the time that order in council was issued, I think he quickly left Government House and not Government House, he probably left office. And eventually Guyana peacefully got elections in 1966. So what the PPP was trying to portray to people in Guyana, that it was a national revolution and it was going to bring independence by force, if necessary, to what was then British Guyana. Well, really, the PPP wanted to control the sugar workers on the ground and the MPs in the Legislative Council with that old first past the post system. It does not suit them. And if you look at the political systems of many European countries like Germany or Italy, even Israel, it's a PR system. And people work with coalitions. Don't believe that the Westminster first past the post system is the only system. Many countries, enlightened countries, learn to work together on the basis of proportional representation. So it was all about control. That is what the PPP is about. It's about control. It's not about consensus. It's not about cooperation. It's not about collaboration. Control, control, control. But they were well prepared for the hurricane of protest. They were well prepared for the campaign of violence because they mobilized sugar workers. They had taken the trouble to train a couple of hundred of the Progressive Youth Organization young people in foreign countries in violence and sabotage. And they got weapons. Weapons didn't come from Guyana, the weapons came from abroad. They got money from communist countries. And that was the source of another problem in the country. The money and the weapons that were coming into Guyana in 1964. My friends, Gawo's campaign of terror did start on the sugar estates with the physical harassment of strike breakers. And they call them strike breakers, but of course they were not strike breakers because they belonged to a union called the Manpower Citizens Association. And so their union didn't call a strike. Gawo was not a recognized union, so the strike was non-lawful to start with. So even after the official strike started on the 3rd of March, the very next day, literally day one of the strike, Gunraj and Monroe were murdered. That is what Nesbitt Changur was singing about in the song that you heard. On day one of the strike, from the 4th of March, 1964. And later on, members of the PYO who thought they were going abroad to learn electrical wiring and vehicle motor maintenance and house construction came back and said, no, they were being trained in sabotage. And there was one, Akbar Ali, I think he's from East Country, he said he didn't go to abroad to learn that. And within a month, he was a dead man for exposing what the training abroad was all about. So from day one, my friends, in the 4th of March, 1964, the killing started. And these killings degenerated into massacres. Today, I will just look at three of the massacres very briefly. It's impossible to deal with all of them, and I think maybe some of you listening, looking at this program, might not agree with the selection because there were many instances in which massacres occurred. The first one I'd like to deal with is what they call the Working Russ Massacre. The Working Russ Massacre. This was a mass killing in which 8 members of the Abraham family who were living in Hatfield Street in Working Russ, all Portuguese, they were killed at home when at night their home was firebombed on the 12th of June, 1964. This attack was in retaliation. Remember those 2 words, in retaliation, for the alleged leak of information by a member of the family who was employed as a clerk in what was then the Barclays Bank BCO. Of course, during the period of nationalization, that bank disappeared. But at the time in 1964, this girl, who was a member of the Guyana United Youth Society, which was the youth arm of the United Force, was a clerk at the Barclays Bank, and she was charged with seditious libel. But when proof was published in the Daily Chronicle that money was transferred from Moscow through London to Georgetown by the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, to the People's Progressive Party, within a month after the charge was dropped by the director of public prosecution, the DPP, he was forced to withdraw the charge to what the lawyers call null pros, because, of course, the charge was based on falsehood. The money was actually transferred, and there was actual proof that the money was transferred. But within a month, that house was burned down on the 12th of June. Mrs. Jagan resigned as Minister of Home Affairs on some other pretext on the 1st of June, and a fortnight later, less than a fortnight later, we had the first big massacre, the killing of the Abraham family in Working Russ. And this attack was in retaliation against this young lady who was a bank clerk, who was suspected of having leaked the money transfer from Moscow to the PPP at that time. And of course, the charge of sedition had to be withdrawn. Other people were charged, but I don't want to mention names at this point in time. But what I'm telling you is that the first big massacre of the disturbances on the 12th of June of the Abraham family was in retaliation for a perceived action against the People's Progressive Party. The next month, July 1964, there was the biggest massacre in Guyana's history. 53 passengers, all persons of African descent, were killed when the launch in which they were traveling, the Son Chapman launch, was bombed. Again, timed bomb, just like in Tain, a timed bomb. That is how these terrorists were trained. They trained in the same way. They were making bombs in the same way. That is what happened. No bomb was thrown, the bomb was planted and set to go off at a certain time. While the Son Chapman launch was traveling from Georgetown to Mackenzie on the Demerara, 6th of July. So the first one we had the 12th of June, next one we have on the 6th of July. This was in retaliation. Remember the 2 words, in retaliation, for what the PPP called the Wisma atrocity. And the Wisma atrocity on the 24th of May was in retaliation for the murder of an African couple in Buxton. So you can see the cycle of violence. Um, Out of the blue, two old Africans were killed in the Buxton Friendship Back Dam. They had packed their bateau to come back out to the front, um, and their bodies were discovered badly mutilated. These were not just shot, and I will not describe the nature of the mutilation, but people were angry. And of course, if you know what happens, there's a cycle of anger. Anger leads to murder, murder leads to anger, and so on. But we come to that in a minute. But the Wismar atrocity was in retaliation. And people don't explain, it didn't just happen. Wismar is not in a sugar belt. There was no strike at Wismar. But many of the people living in Mackenzie that time were really workers who had come from the coast, East Coast, Demerara, West Coast, Berbice, and so on. And when the murders were reported, there was an outbreak of violence at Wismar. There's no justification, but what I'm saying is that it was an atrocity and it should not be condoned. But because of that atrocity, we had a couple of weeks later, in July, on the 6th of July, 1964, not 2 or 3, but 53 persons of African descent were killed. There's a particular book that the PPP loves to quote from. The author of that book, or the editor of the book, reported that these 53 people drowned. You know, it was not a Sunday school party in which, you know, children were drowned. This was a terrorist attack in which a boat with 53 human beings were traveling, more than 53 actually, because those days we didn't have a highway. The highway was built by the PNC after independence. People traveled from Georgetown to Mackenzie by either by the ferry or the boat. And that boat, it was a launch, a river launch called the Sun Chapman. Of course, by traveling by launch, you know, you could get up there more quickly than if you waited for the RH car, which was the bigger ferry between Georgetown and I think it was owned by the Sproston's company at that time. So we've had now 2 massacres which came about in retaliation. So what we start to see in the disturbances is a cycle of violence. And the third one I will deal with, as I said, I can't deal with all of them on this program, but you can read for yourself because books have been published. At Maikoni, this is called the Maikoni, I call it the Maikoni Massacre, and 7 members of the Jaikaran family, all Indians. So the first massacre was of Portuguese, the Working Rust Massacre. The second massacre was of Africans, the Hordaya Massacre. The third was of Indians, the Jaikaran, more or less the Jaikaran family. They were killed at Chance, Maikoni, on the 28th of August. So we had June, July, August. This is what was happening almost systematically in 1964. This massacre itself was in retaliation for the murder of several other persons, Africans, along the Maikoni River. There was a particularly gruesome one at Mortis, in which some boys, some young farmers, were told that the cows were straying in the savannah. When they went there, they saw some armed men on horseback who shot them down. But that's another story. I'll explain on another occasion how one member he fell into a ditch and they missed him. The other bodies disappeared. it is assumed that they were tied onto some heavy logs and they sunk in the Maikoni River, never to be seen again. And several people were killed, not only those young men, but also the pastor and his wife were murdered. And I think eventually these murders, which were occurring in different parts of Maikoni, culminated in the massacre of the Jaikaran family in retaliation for those murders. So what you can say is the best thing is not to start the murders anyway, in the first place, because there will always be retaliation. Anger triggers murder, murder triggers anger, and so on. So we can now look at the question of how these massacres occurred, what people call the etiology of massacres, the causation of massacres. To use a clinical term, these massacres have to be examined carefully, so not emotionally. And we need to look at ways to avoid killing in Guyana. And I think if we can understand the nature of the massacres in 1964, we can teach our children to build a more peaceful society so that they can look forward to a good life. The PPP's campaign in 1964 to make the country ungovernable was aimed, as I said earlier, to prevent the elections from being held. But they used this Leninist approach, cruel revolutionary terror. This is what Vladimir Lenin taught them. Cruel revolutionary terror. It introduced terror into villages in which ethnic groups were living peacefully side by side for decades. I mean, sometimes it's very difficult to believe how peaceful Guyana was before the PPP campaign of violence. People like, Eugene Corral are Buxtonians. I think there was a Catholic bishop, who grew up in Buxton and in Plaisance. There's a Portuguese attorney general who, member of Plaisance community. The villages were mixed, and there was no trace of racial hostility, much as murder, before 1964. And we need to look at some theories which explain these murders. I'm not a scientist, but those of you who are scientifically minded may want to look at these theories to see if they have any validity. But the first theory I would suggest is a theory of the cycle of retaliation. And this theory suggests that anger could trigger murder, and murder could trigger anger. So I call it the anger cycle. And it means that once there's anger, it could trigger murder, which triggers anger, which triggers murder, and so on. The cycle could be endless, as you can see in some European countries. Some of them are still angry with something that happened in 1504, or something like that. So the best thing to do is not to start the cycle of murder in the first place, because this cycle of retaliation was definitely, in my mind, a contributory factor to the ferocity of violence in 1964. The cycle of retaliation was a contributory factor to the terrorism of 1964, in which the consequence of one action becomes the cause of a subsequent action. The second factor I would like to contribute to this discussion is the crisis of credibility. I'm suggesting that Gao's campaign of violence targeted unresisting victims who were uninvolved in the union strike in the sugar industry. The two farmers in the back of Buxton had nothing to do with sugar industry, had nothing to do with strike, had nothing to do with the People's Progressive Party. But these actions by the GAWU and the PPP were not directed at the British colonial officials. You can't name any British colonial officials who were attacked. They were not directed at the British troops who were here in vast numbers. They were not even directed at British plantation officers, but they were directed at poor villagers. Or you can almost say poor, harmless villagers who were not involved in the struggles of GAU and the PPP at the time. And the third factor I'd like to mention very briefly is the responsibility to protect. Every government, regardless of which party it comes from, regardless of which country you're living in, has a responsibility to protect its citizens. And in British Guyana in 1964, the PPP formed the government and it abandoned its responsibility to protect the population from violence. Mr. U.C. Quayana, at that time Sidney King, the founder of ASCRA, actually held a vigil outside of Government House, calling on the government to proclaim a state of emergency because of the killings that were taking place in West Coast Demerara. And for a long time, the PPP refused to declare a state of emergency. And the result was that the killings were going on. And that is one of the contributions Sidney King made to calling attention to the murders taking place, particularly in West Demerara in 1964. The result was that the British governor, who himself was a veteran of World War II, he seized, well, legally, executive authority for public security because clearly the PPP was not paying attention to human safety and public security. And he ordered the deployment of the British troops. He ordered the detention of the masterminds of the violence. And these masterminds included 32 members of the People's Progressive Party and 2 members of the PNC. And those members of the People's Progressive Party included the deputy premier and other ministers of government. Some of the detainees are still alive. And we must ask them why they were detained. And it was because of the government's executive action that order was finally restored. So, my friends, the massacres of 1964 during the disturbances, during what the PPP called the Hurricane protest, failed to achieve their immediate objective. And instead, they triggered an unanticipated cycle of retaliation. This year, 2024, is the 60th anniversary year of the disturbances. And we are reminded, and we need to remind or teach the present generation about the long-term damage that the massacres did to this country. They damaged social cohesion. They divided society. And this is the legacy of the People's Progressive Party in office in 1964. Its campaign of violence, its hurricane of protests, turned out to be a campaign of massacres against ordinary poor Guyanese villagers. May God bless our country, and may we never see this type of violence again from any government in office. Let us give our children the prospect of a happy and good life in this country of their birth. Thank you, and may God bless you.
Where in the lorry they come, out of the darkness is pelted, out of blackness comes the bomb. Negro and Indian screaming, onto the roadway they fall. Is this the only way races will join today? Join in barbarous death, gun, raj, and Monroe. All end in agony, when will our hatreds end? and race with race work together as friends. Anywhere hatred is sown, violence will grow and be spread. First Alice crushed in the roadway, and Gardner cut down and dead. Now meaningless death all around us, from Buxton to Wismar men die. So many lives we see wasted in tragedy. See how our hatred destroys Diana.
Let us cooperate for the yellow. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must